Attention cloud professionals. Secure your seat for Gartner IT Infrastructure, Operations, and Cloud Strategies Conference 2024 on December 10th through 12th in Las Vegas. Discover how AI and cloud innovations are transforming the industry. Learn from top experts, share best practices, and connect with over 5,000 of your peers. Don't miss this opportunity to stay ahead of the fast-evolving world of cloud computing. Register now at gartner.com/us/IO. That's gartner.com/us/IO.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Middle of September, starting to creep up on us. Another weekend perspective. And, as we were doing the shows, coming out of August, there was a part of me that felt a little bit of malaise just in terms of, didn't feel like there was a lot of really big stories going on, especially just kind of around cloud, I guess maybe. AI always feels like it's got something going on, but, didn't feel like there was a lot going on with cloud. And it got me thinking, and I do this thing oftentimes where I try and connect the dots between what's going on in our world and maybe something that I've experienced in the past. And, I have this, maybe it's a good tendency, maybe it's a bad tendency to try and put things a little bit in historical perspective. And it got me thinking a little bit back to, probably like 2002-ish timeframe. And I know that's sort of dating myself. We're going back 20 years and you're thinking, well, 20 years ago, gosh, none of that technology was the same. But what it felt like was, we had kind of gone through some things, and obviously we've gone through the pandemic, and a lot's changed since the pandemic over the 2020, 2021, 2022. And so we kind of came out of that, and there was a certain amount of feeling of, well, what's going to happen next? Like, we kind of have the internet, and some of the bigger companies have gone through some things, some smaller companies have gone through some things, and it was weird because there was a certain feeling of like we just kind of couldn't figure out what was going to happen next. We were kind of like, well, things feel fine. Like, we're doing fine. We have the internet. We have network bandwidth. We're starting to see some new stuff happen. Some things didn't work out from a, use case perspective or business model perspective, but it felt fine, right? And there was a certain amount of like, I guess this is just going to kind of be where we are. And I don't necessarily feel like that's where we are today, but I do have a certain perspective on that, like, well, what's going to happen next? Like, do we have the right things in place? And I kind of want to dig into that after the break in terms of just some stuff. It feels like there is actually a lot of stuff going on, but it isn't so much purely headline stuff, but it does feel like some major macro level stuff is going through some stuff, if you will. And I want to dig into that after the break. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I want to I have this sort of weird feeling right now in terms of what's going to come next. And sometimes, you feel like, okay, there's a lot going on. And so you're just kind of connecting the dots, or there's a lot going on and you're trying to figure out what's new. Like, how does the new stuff work and how's it going to impact what I do or what your business and all those sort of things. And then there's times when you feel like, okay, everything's bad, right? And we've had, we joked around a little bit of that on some of the shows this summer on some things that felt like maybe they were going through some stuff, and whether they were, some economic news or some layoffs or, certain things, some announcements and so forth. And then there's times when you're kind of like, I'm not exactly sure what's going on, right? Like, I feel like I have a handle on things, but it also feels like there's a bunch of stuff sort of bubbling under the surface that if it goes a certain way, if the winds shift a certain way, if the firmament under your feet shifts a little bit, things could change a lot, right? And as I was thinking about this show, and I was thinking about kind of what's going on, and sometimes I find myself, being a little myopic in terms of like, oh, I'm only looking at cloud specific things, or I'm only looking at AI specific things, since those are the two kind of main things that we tend to focus on with this show. And I sort of stepped back and I started, kind of looking at the broader set of news that's been going on, the broader set of trends that's been going on. And I had 4 or 5 things that I've been looking at that I'm like, it feels like some things might change a lot. And again, these are just kind of feelings and perceptions on stuff, but it does feel like there's some big stuff going on. And because there's so many other things going on in the world right now, whether it's the unfortunate sort of set of wars going on sort of in the Middle East, or whether it's, just the politics of the United States, the noise that goes on with that's taking up a lot of things, whether it's, the kids are back in school and people aren't as focused on technology, or because, sports are taking off in football and people are focused on their fantasy football team. It does feel like there are some stuff that is worth exploring. And I say it worth exploring in the context of the last time I kind of felt like this, and I mentioned this at the top of the show, was post the, kind of the first internet bubble burst. And I literally remember talking to friends and colleagues and so forth, and feeling like, well, what's going to happen next, right? Like, we had seen, a bunch of internet companies kind of fall apart. Even the sort of stalwarts like Cisco had, kind of collapsed to a certain extent, but they were still there. But there was just these sort of big macro things getting in their way. You had uncertainty about, like, okay, is this the end of what our technology? We sort of reached the pinnacle of where this technology was going. People didn't have a great vision about what was going to kind of come next. And I kind of have that feeling a little bit right now. And so here's the stuff that's sort of bouncing around in my head. And again, I'm always trying to connect the dots a little bit to see if, this is just purely circumstance, or whether there's, some connectivity between these things, or, this is just sort of the news of the week and it's going to kind of float away. So the first one that jumped out at me was, we are seeing more and more, kind of legal aspect of what's going on with Google and some of the antitrust stuff. Some of the Google is starting to lose some legal cases, which they really never did before, in terms of, antitrust, and whether or not their business, which, for the most part, this is where you get into these sort of weird situations of, what is monopoly? Some people like Ben Thompson have done a really good job of, like, what is antitrust, and, do the laws of antitrust really apply to the new world in which you're not necessarily like blocking people out because of, certain anti-competitive things, but you're doing it because, it's a weird situation, because essentially in the past, it always used to be antitrust was, if you are harming the consumer, then, the antitrust rules would sort of apply. But in this case, the things that Google tends to provide that consumers use tend to be free. They tend to like the services. And so, it's a weird situation. But we're seeing more and more of Google at least losing, or, being charged more and more with these things around antitrust. And it's one of the, Google is one of the most fundamental things in what we do in technology, because not only do they provide, one of the most fundamental things that we deal with, which is search, right? Sort out the internet for me, basically, and make it as simple as possible to get to. So this unbelievably important service they provide in search, but they're also sort of the center of how so much of the online things are monetized, right? So whether it's, search ads and so forth, whether it's, SEO for your business and marketing, whether it's people making money on YouTube or on Instagram or those types of things. I guess they don't on Instagram, but on YouTube, they're such a foundational thing. And having lived through the Microsoft stuff, where Microsoft went through antitrust, it didn't necessarily destroy the company by any means. Microsoft is, back to being a $3 trillion valued company, but they went through a period of time in which, because of the rules that were applied to them, due to the antitrust, rulings, they sort of missed some things. And it does make me wonder if, one of the most fundamental companies that we have in our industry, is going to go through some things, and what are going to be the ramifications if Google, is hindered, right? What does that mean? And I don't really know what that means. And the reason I mentioned that I don't really know what that means is, to put this back into context, when I kind of went through this sort of set of perceptions and feelings back in 2002-ish, we didn't know the iPhone was coming, right? There wasn't sort of this like, well, when this new mobile phone thing starts to work itself out, like we're talking about AI, like the concept of sort of smartphones didn't exist. The concepts of sort of SaaS didn't exist. Some of the things that we've come to expect in terms of how the web is programmed, and the thing that comes to mind is like, something called Ajax, which was sort of like how people were building this sort of like live interactive web. And Ajax isn't exactly what it was, but I remember that being kind of a big deal, because that was how things like Google Maps was working, and it was making it feel very, very alive. Those things we didn't even have on our radar. We couldn't even fathom them, right? They didn't exist. They weren't like, once this thing sort of works itself out. And so I start to wonder, Google being one of the biggest pillars of the internet and cloud computing and AI and all these sort of, mobile and so forth, all the places it plays, is that something that we will see if the world goes the way it's going, right? If the legal fights that they're having with the government go the way they look like they're going, and there's some antitrust ramifications, does a kind of slowed down or impacted Google? What are the ripples that come out of that? So that's the first one I've sort of been thinking about. The second one, and we actually, Brandon Witchard and I cover this quite a bit on the next next show, the one that's coming out on Wednesday in Cloud News of the Month, is Intel, biggest chip manufacturer in the world, in terms, at least have been for the longest time. And I know, things like ARM and TSMC and the things that they do, in terms of pure volume, is making a huge kind of number on the scene. But Intel has been the biggest chip manufacturer in the world, at least in terms of the world that we tend to live in, which is, cloud. They're going through some things, right? They're not going through some like sort of, they're late on their, latest chips and so forth. They're going through some things that are fundamentally changing, where their role is in the world. And, we've been seeing this for a decade plus, but we're now seeing it as, is this recoverable? Is the Intel that we've known and the tentacles that Intel has all over the place, are those going to fundamentally change, right? And we think about Intel as, the server manufacturer, it's the PC it's the laptop manufacturer in terms of chips and so forth, but it's also the company that, quite honestly, like funds tons and tons of marketing activities across enterprises, and so it has downstream ramifications for all the companies that it partners with. It will have ramifications on, national security, not just for the United States, but on, sort of NATO countries and Western allied countries and so forth. And so, kind of looking at where Intel is, it feels like a great unknown. And it feels like what will be the ramifications of, Intel kind of going through some things. Do they get broken up? Do they get this huge amount of funding from the United States government to create a, sort of safer national security chip manufacturer, because of the concerns with TSMC and them being in Taiwan and being near China and all those, sort of geopolitical ramifications. So, they're sort of the second big thing that has me wondering, like, well, what's that pillar feeling unstable going to look like, right? What are the things 3 or 4 years from now that them going through some things is going to change fundamentally in our industry? The third thing feels like, so we've dealt with sort of the internet, if you will, search, advertising. We've dealt with chips. The next thing that comes to mind is sort of the uncertainty around software, right? We are seeing so many things, we've seen for a decade plus, all of the growth and the things that have happened with open source. And now for the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen, the biggest discussion in open source has been people pulling away from open source, companies that have been building stuff with open source, changing their licensing, whether you call it a rug pull or license change or whatever you want to call it. We've seen more and more lack of companies being able to commercialize software built with open source. And we've gone so long in open source with the idea of sort of free up front and collaboration and integration and so forth being driven because of open source. I don't think open source, the concept, is going away, but I think we're going to go through a reckoning of, what does the business model look like around open source? What are the ramifications? What happens when another one of these pillars that so many things are now built upon, goes through some things and changes? And, this has downstream ramifications for contributors and for foundations and for, all sorts of things that, more and more we depend on every day. The internet's fundamentally built on open source technologies. What does that mean? So that's the third sort of pillar that I had in my mind, that it feels like there's a lot going on, but it feels like the certainty of what's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 years is, being questioned. Fourth thing I had on my list is something we've been talking about all the time on the show, which is AI. Obviously, AI is getting tons of news and buzz and so forth. But I think we're beginning to see the sort of earliest phases of, how will this monetize, right? And what's interesting is, right now it feels like there's sort of a duopoly between OpenAI in the model space and NVIDIA in the hardware space. And there's, tons of activity around it, but it's around those two things. And they have, massive, in the case of NVIDIA, huge market share, but also huge market valuation. The market is sort of on pins and needles as to, will they continue to stay at that level? What will happen if they miss some numbers or if their downstream customers can't monetize? And OpenAI feels like this amazing technology company that has sort of, very uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty around their leadership, and they're raising, insane amounts of money and are trying to raise insane amounts of money with, humongous goals and so forth. And again, we've seen that over and over again, in which so much money in the system, with sort of rapidly growing valuations, not sort of long-term sustained valuations, oftentimes has some, not sort of short-term impacts, but sort of crashing type of impacts. And I'm not by any means calling for a crash in the AI space, but there is so much money being pumped into it, with the expectations being so high. Having lived through the dot-com bubble burst and things coming out of that, that's another one of those pillars that you go, boy, it's sort of hard to predict what the next 3 or 4 years will look like, and if certain things go certain ways, what creative things are people going to kind of come up with that come out of that. And then the fifth thing I had on my list was governments, and it does feel like more and more, and again, government policies change over time, and they change maybe every 2 years or every 4 years with elections. So this is one of those ones that sort of comes and goes. But it does feel like more and more we're seeing, whether these are how marketplaces work in the EU, whether this is AI regulation in the United States, whether this is sort of geopolitical things going on with how companies deal with China and so forth. But it does feel like there's more and more kind of a specter of regulation hanging over technology, maybe more so than it ever has. And part of that's going to be because technology is part of our everyday life, and regulation is part of our everyday life. And there's always a balance between, allowing, freedom of, whatever it is the regulation is involved with, whether it's freedom of, human rights, or regulation or around like the environment, or legal laws or financial laws. Technology is so embedded in everything we do. It's not unusual that we're seeing more and more regulation. It's just, I think it feels more than we've seen in the past. And a lot of these are regulations around things that are so widely spread that oftentimes the regulation, has certain intentions, and the way that they actually implement them, or the way that they happen in practice, is oftentimes different than that. And so that's one of those things that you kind of have to keep an eye on, because if you hadn't been that involved with the regulatory stuff before, and now it becomes more part of what you're doing, it's going to change where you go, what your direction is going to be, what your strategy is going to be, what your next steps are going to be. So, I kind of see those 4 or 5 pillars right now as, if you look at them from far away, you might say, oh, they're fine, they're stable, they're okay, but we've got internet search and advertising, we've got chips, we've got open source and software, we've got AI and monetization, and we've got government regulation. And it feels like there's been a lot going on lately that if you're really paying attention to it, you're like, there's probably some really big shifts coming in that space. And you can think through the next couple of steps, but if some of these things go further than what may seem like it's in the norm, it does feel like there's going to be some very interesting things potentially coming out of 3 or 4 years from now. And by interesting, I mean unknown in terms of interesting. And, oftentimes what happens in technology is when we have unknowns, when there are uncertainties, people start to get really creative, and we see explosions of creativity like we've never seen before. And again, I point back to, sort of the time period from say 2004 to 2008, tremendous amount of creativity that happened in there, right? The iPhone, cloud computing, new programming models, virtualization really sort of took off. So, we've seen this trend before. We've seen these sort of scenarios before. And I do feel like there are probably going to be some very, very unique opportunities, maybe not in the next 6 months to 9 months, but I think we're going to start seeing some people, having some ideas that might seem sort of crazy, start to work on some stuff that might become the next foundational things for the next 20 years of the internet. So anyway, it's just a hunch, just sort of a, spidey sense, if you will. But as I was thinking about this week, and I was just sort of looking at stuff outside of, again, my sort of day-to-day purview of cloud and AI, it does feel like there's some bigger things on the horizon. So definitely something we'll definitely be keeping an eye on. Curious what your thoughts are on this, if you're seeing some things more than that. But anyways, so that'll wrap it up. Hope everybody's having a good weekend. Hope everybody's, going to have a good week ahead of them. I'm going to wrap up for the week. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the show. And show at thecloudcast.net if there's things that we can try and help you out with. And with that, I'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.